I wanted to produce a quick overview video of how to use my astrophotography macros for Affinity Photo. There are quite a few options in the macro pack, and I designed them with particular workflows in mind. So I wanted to communicate to you all how to get the most out of them. Let's start with installation of the macros. If you are unfamiliar with what macros are, they allow you to record and instantly play back a limitless set of operations. You can build up complex macros that automate an otherwise arduous workflow, or you can simply repeat certain operations that you use frequently. To install the macros, the easiest approach is to drag-drop the AF macros files into Affinity Photo and let go of the mouse button over the interface. The macro library panel will open on the left-hand side here with the macros populated in the list view. Now you can also open the library panel manually by going to View, Studio, and enabling Library here. Then with the library panel open, you can click this option here and import the macros. I would, however, argue that the drag-drop approach is more intuitive. Now let's move on to the macros themselves. So within the Astrophotography 32-bit category, at the bottom here, you will find a number of composition setup macros. These automate the initial process of mapping your monochrome data to red, green, and blue color information. Now, before we look at the actual macros, I think it's really important to show the general stacking process here, because I see a lot of astrophotography tutorials for Affinity Photo that focus on emulating an outdated, destructive workflow from Photoshop, where you start copying and pasting channel data into a new layer within a separate document, and the whole process becomes quite convoluted. The workflow within Affinity Photo, if I just go to File and New Astrophotography Stack, is designed to minimize the need for channel manipulation, and there is also a feature within the Astrophotography Stack workspace or persona called File Groups, where you can stack and align all of your data as individual layers within one document, which is a huge time saver. So as an example, I'm going to use File Groups here to stack some narrowband data of the Eagle Nebula. So first of all, I'll go to Add Files. I'll find my calibrated light frames here. I've got my hydrogen alpha data. I'll just open all of these fit files. And under the filter drop-down here, I'll select H alpha. Then I'll create my second file group by clicking here. Go to Add Files. I'll do the same for the oxygen data. And under Filter here, I'll choose the oxygen designation. Then I'll create my third file group and add the sulfur data here and give Filter the sulfur designation. And before I stack, across on stacking options, I'll set the sigma clipping threshold to 2, then click Stack. And I've just changed the sigma clipping threshold to 2 here to ensure that the stacking process will reject a greater number of outlier pixels to minimize any remaining hot pixels. Okay, so once the stacking is complete, I can just cycle through my 3 stacked layers here. Then once I'm happy with those, I'll click Apply, and we will move back to the main photo persona. Now across on the Layers panel, I have my 3 stacked grayscale data layers, plus levels and curves adjustment layers, which are performing tone stretching. Normally at this point, if I wasn't using the macros, I would change the blend mode of these 3 layers to Add. Then I would add recolor adjustment layers and clip them into each layer. Instead, however, I can use one of these composition setup macros to automate this process. All I have to do first is name my layers accordingly. So this one needs to be HA, this one needs to be SII, and this one needs to be OIII, like so. Then I can run one of the appropriate composition setup macros. For example, if I wanted Hubble palette color mapping, I can use the SHO composition setup macro just by clicking on it, like so. Alternatively, if I wanted to have the dominant HA data mapped to red, I could undo this using Command Z on Mac or Control Z on Windows. Then I could run the HSO composition setup macro instead. Now, rather than doing manual tone stretching based on the starting point we are given here with these two layers, we can then utilize one of the automated tone stretching macros, which will typically give you a very good workable result straight away. Now, to make the most of these macros, which are located at the top of the category here, we should typically hide or delete the initial tone stretching adjustment layers. So we will just hide these two layers here. I can then run the normalized tone stretch macro, which will produce a merged layer, and this provides a really good starting point for further work. Now, you'll notice that there are 4 tone stretching macro options. There is no right or wrong approach, but generally I would recommend the following. Normalized tone stretch works well for narrowband data compositions, so that's SHO, HSO, and all the variants there. Logarithmic tone stretch can work for both narrowband and broadband data compositions, and is sometimes useful for teasing out more color in star detail. It may, however, also bring forward more prominent background color casts, so be prepared to deal with these using the Remove Background filter. Color preserving tone stretch works amazingly well for broadband imagery, especially with galaxies where it's sometimes difficult to bring out more subtle color tones. With narrowband imagery, it tends to oversaturate color detail quite easily, although you are always welcome to experiment with it. Color preserving tone stretch plus performs an extra stretch that really helps to tease out fainter detail. Again, I would primarily use this with broadband imagery and not narrowband imagery, but do experiment and see what works for you. To give you an idea of the other composition setups, you can automate the color mapping for more straightforward compositions, such as RGB and sRGB, where you have luminance data that needs to be used with a luminosity blend mode. Then you can also achieve more exotic combinations of data, such as HORGBL, which uses hydrogen alpha, oxygen, red, green and blue data for color, and luminance for luminosity blending. Please do look at the accompanying PDF README, as it will tell you how to name your data layers in order for the macros to work correctly. With the initial composition setup and tone stretching macros covered, let's look at some of the retouching macros. Live Background Mask and Live Star Mask are designed to help you visualize luminance masks based on your image's tonal range. Live Background Mask, for example, will mask out the brighter areas, making them transparent, leaving the darker areas intact. You can double-click on the Live Background Mask layer here to change the threshold and the threshold scale. Once you have your desired mask, you can then go to Layer and Merge Visible, and this will create a new pixel layer with just the darker tonal information on it. At this point, you can hide or delete the Live Background Mask layer, and then I could, for example, add a curves adjustment using Command M on Mac or Control M on Windows, and I could clip it into this new pixel layer just by click dragging and offering it to the label or the text of the layer, then releasing the mouse button. This would allow me to stretch the background tones and bring out some of the fainter detail without brightening the central areas of the nebula. Now you also have a Live Star Mask macro. This will do the opposite and allow you to mask just the brighter areas. So, with a newly merged pixel layer like before, I can hide the Live Star Mask layer, and then I could, for example, use an unsharp mask filter with a large kernel or radius to enhance local contrast in the image. But crucially, we're just affecting the brighter central areas of the nebula. The Live RGB weighted mask macro will allow you to create masks based on additive color weights. So I can double click on the layer that has just been added here to gain access to the controls. Then I can use the weighting control here to isolate just the prominent star detail. Then I can go to Layer, Merge Visible to create a merged layer, hide the initial Live RGB weighted mask layer. Then, as I did in the previous example, I could add a curves adjustment layer, clip it into this newly created pixel layer and just do a nonlinear curve boost to brighten that prominent star detail without affecting the rest of the image. After doing this, I could get this layer, drag it to the top, show it again, double-click the layer, and this time I could change the weighting, then reduce the clamping, and create a mask based on some of this red nebula detail here. So as before, I can go to Layer, Merge Visible, then hide the live RGB weighted mask layer, and finally, I could go to Filters, Sharpen, and Clarity to enhance the structure of just these areas without over-brightening the star detail. Thresholded Star Mask allows you to create a detailed mask of the image's star detail and configure it using several options. For example, I could increase star threshold to ensure I am only masking the brightest star detail. Then, I could experiment with star selection padding. This will pad the selection area around each star, but actually for this example, the default value of 1 pixel is sufficient. Star smoothing allows you to blur and smooth out the selection area around each star, which is quite useful if you will be pushing the star detail with adjustments or filters, since they will graduate nicely into the adjacent areas around the stars. You could even disable smoothing by changing this option to 0 pixels, or we could just add a small amount of star smoothing by typing a value such as 0.5 pixels. When we are happy with the mask, we can click Apply, and I now have a mask layer which is currently masking everything beneath it in the layer stack. To use this mask practically, one example would be to add an HSL adjustment. I can do this using Command U on Mac or Control U on Windows. Then I want to click drag this mask layer and offer it to the thumbnail of the HSL adjustment layer. Then release the mouse button. So now I might double click the HSL shift adjustment and increase saturation to add some more color detail to the stars. Alternatively, I might instead just lower the luminosity slightly, and this will just decrease the intensity of the star detail in the overall image. Weighted saturation mask is similar to the live RGB weighted mask, but instead of generating a manual mask, it will allow you to mask a vibrance adjustment that can increase or decrease color intensity. Once the macro is run, you can expand the weighted saturation mask group in order to gain access to the mask and adjustment settings. I will quickly double-click on vibrance and saturation and just increase the saturation slider to give you a clearer idea of how this works. So now I can double-click on the live RGB weighted mask layer, and this will bring up the mask settings. Clamping will control the overall strength of the mask. Then you can use the elevation rotation input here to control the RGB weighting of the mask instead. So you can just use these two options in conjunction with one another to fine-tune the areas that receive a saturation or a vibrance boost. And if you ever want to see what the vibrance adjustment would look like without the mask, simply hide the live RGB weighted mask layer, and then we can show it again to demonstrate exactly what the mask is doing. The effect here is perhaps slightly too strong, so I can just tweak the weighting control here until I am happy with the result. Affinity Photo has a really useful remove background filter, which is perfect for neutralizing gradient color casts in your images once they have been tone stretched. However, it is a destructive filter, so you will usually find yourself creating a merged pixel layer in order to apply it. If you have a relatively simple color cast, like this green background cast here, you can instead remove it non-destructively using this macro. So all I need to do is run the live background subtraction macro. Then on the layers panel, you will see I have this sampled color fill layer selected. And up here on the color panel, I just need to click drag the color picker icon, then release the mouse button over one of the background tones. Then just single click here to apply it as the active fill. Then I just need to enable or show the top group layer here. In addition, I can double click black level offset and change output black level if the background is too dark or too bright. Then of course, you would do further tonal stretching if required. Like so. Reduce background luminosity utilizes the live background mask functionality to darken background tones, creating more contrast between the deep sky object and the background. Once the macro has been run, you can double-click the live background mask layer here to access the controls. Decreasing threshold will register more areas of the image as background tones, which will then be darkened. Threshold scale will scale the threshold slider up or down, which will allow you to tailor the effect to your own imagery. Smoothing will smooth out the generated mask and also affect its strength. So you can use this in conjunction with the threshold slider to fine-tune the darkening of the background. You can also double-click the luminosity layer and modify the luminosity shift slider if you want to further darken the background. To show you the before and after, I can quickly hide the top level group, then show it again. And of course, if you still want to experiment with the parameters to achieve a different result, it's all non-destructive, so just double-click the live background mask layer again, and then experiment with these options here. The Reduce Star Luminosity macro takes advantage of the Live Star Mask functionality to darken brighter tones, which can help prevent intense stars from overpowering an image. Across here, we can expand the group, then double-click the Live Star Mask layer to access the controls, and similar to the Reduce Background Luminosity macro, you can use Threshold to control the number of brighter tones that are affected by the mask and therefore darkened. For this example, I could increase the threshold scale, then also decrease smoothing all the way to darken most of the brighter areas. Now, because we are also darkening the Andromeda Galaxy, particularly its core, what we can do is select the luminosity layer, then get the paintbrush tool, so that is B on the keyboard. Make sure our hardness is set to 0. Increase the brush width. And across on the color panel, we just want to make sure we are painting with pure black. Then we can just paint away from the luminosity layer's mask, like so. Now, if we compare the before and after, by hiding and showing the top level group, we can appreciate the effect this is having, where we are reducing the luminosity of all the surrounding star detail here. When Reduce Star Intensity is used, a star mask is created and applied to this filter layer. This reduces the size of star detail and therefore makes stars less overpowering within the overall image. To change the strength, you can double-click the Reduce Star Intensity layer, then increase the radius value. For example, the default is 2 pixels, but we could try 4 pixels to reduce star intensity further. Star Eater works very well for broadband or one-shot color imagery, where star detail is plentiful and very distracting. It non-destructively reduces the size and strength of stars in the image. Try and add it before most of your layer work, especially anything that enhances color detail. Otherwise, you may end up with colored artifacts around the stars. For example, if I drag it to the top of the layer stack here, you'll see I have some artifacting. Whereas if I drag it down below, just above the main pixel layers here, that artifacting will then disappear. Inpaint star detail can be quite an intensive operation depending on your image content, so be prepared for this to potentially take up to a minute to complete, or even longer with higher resolution imagery. Essentially, this creates a selection of star detail, then attempts to replace it with neighboring pixel content. The result is that you can automate the removal of more prominent star detail. So for example, let me just hide this layer and you can see the before and the after. There is also a mask layer provided, which will allow you to paint star detail back in by using B for the paintbrush tool, using my Control-Option click-drag modifier on Mac, or Control-Alt click-drag on Windows to modify hardness and width. Then, just making sure my active color is set to black, I can paint onto the mask to reveal some of that star detail again. You will notice there is a version of the macro appended with dimmer. This is for imagery, where the star detail may not be overly bright, for example with narrowband compositions. Again, a mask layer is provided, which is essential for this image of the Tarantula Nebula, since most of the bright nebula detail has been affected. So I can just paint with black onto this mask layer to reveal some of that more important detail, like so. And again, here is the before and the after. Remove star fringing is nice and straightforward, and it is used for tackling colored fringing around high contrast star detail, like in this image. Simply run the macro, then double click on the Remove Star Fringing layer, and move the Fringe color slider until the fringing around the stars disappears, as you can see here. Like most macros, this is a non-destructive operation, so you can apply this anywhere in your layer stack. The selective version of this macro will create a defringe filter that is masked to just the star detail, which is useful if you want to avoid accidentally desaturating other areas of your image. Star motion deconvolution produces quite a subtle effect, and you do need to be zoomed in to appreciate what it is actually doing. It essentially tries to make elongated star trails appear more circular, to reduce the appearance of star motion that may have been as a result of inaccurate tracking or using equipment that is simply not designed for longer exposures. Now, I would advise running the macro quite close to your original data layers before most of your retouching work. So for example here, I will run the macro above the tone stretching adjustments, but before any further adjustment work. When running the macro, we are presented with a dialog that has two options, and we can use the star direction angle control to approximate the direction the stars are trailing in, and you can hold Option on Mac or Alt on Windows to gain further control over the direction. Do be careful when modifying the deconvolution strength, as higher values may result in panderize around the star detail. So I will take this back to 4 pixels. Then click Apply, and I can now hide the group that has just been created so you can see the original star detail. Then I can show the group again so you can see what effect it is actually having. You can always expand the two groups here and double-click the deconvolution layer to change the angle and the radius non-destructively if you wish. So I can really fine-tune the angle here until my stars appear more circular, like so. Soft star glow is a subtle creative effect that gives star detail a diffuse glow outline. Once you have run the macro, you can change the layer opacity to control the overall strength of the effect. Highlight brilliance is another creative effect that intensifies highlight detail and gives it a luminosity boost. Again, you can control the strength of this effect by modifying the layer opacity. Enhance structure gives you a non-destructive method of enhancing structure or texture in your image. Do experiment with the positioning of the layer in your layer stack. Placing it before tonal adjustments or other retouching work tends to exaggerate structure, whereas if you place it above these types of layers, the effect will be less pronounced. You can, of course, also alter the opacity of the layer itself to control the overall strength of the effect. You can also invert its mask by going to Layer and Invert, or using Command-I on Mac or Control-I on Windows. Then you can use the paintbrush tool, which is B on the keyboard, set an appropriate width and hardness, then paint in with white onto the mask over specific areas where you want this effect to apply. The aggressive variation of this macro will produce a merged pixel layer onto which the effect is applied. Because it uses the destructive version of the clarity filter, the effect can be stronger, as it does not have to render in real time. This is useful for imagery where the regular non-destructive variant might be too weak. Of course, you get a mask layer as well. So, like we did in the previous example, we can select the mask, invert it, then paint back in over the areas where we want the effect to apply. Local contrast structure is similar to enhanced structure, but uses different non-destructive techniques and so can result in a different appearance. Experiment with your own imagery and see which you prefer. Of course, you also have a mask layer here, which you can invert and then paint back into to apply the effect selectively if you wish to. Sometimes you will actually want to do the opposite of enhancing structure or local contrast. In this case, you can use soften structure, which will reduce the textural structure and also the harshness of brighter detail. You do also have a mask layer, meaning you can paint with black to stop the softening effect from rendering on certain areas of the image. So here's the before and the after. When sharpening in 32-bit, which composites in a linear color space, you may observe the panderize artifacting around high contrast star detail. This is ugly and undesirable, so I have provided a nonlinear sharpening macro. This composites the sharpening temporarily in gamma-corrected space before transforming back to linear space, which significantly reduces this panderize effect. Nonlinear compositing builds on the same principle as nonlinear sharpening by setting up a group structure that lets you composite layers in gamma-corrected space rather than linear space. You might choose to do this for more predictable results when using blend modes or adjustment layers in particular. For example, if I wanted to color map this grayscale HA data, I could use a gradient map adjustment layer, quickly just set up my colors for the gradient stops, like so. and then compositing this in nonlinear gamma-corrected space is much easier when it comes to positioning the stops. If I just hide these two gamma transform layers, you can clearly see that I would struggle trying to set this gradient map adjustment up when working with linear color values. You can see I just don't have the flexibility in the darker tones here. Whereas if I turn the two gamma transform layers back on, I then have much more flexibility with my gradient map adjustment. RGB Live Luminosity lets you control the luminosity of your image by adjusting the individual contributions from the red, green and blue color data non-destructively. Once the macro has been run, you can double-click the RGB luminosity layer and adjust the red, green and blue contribution sliders until you get the result you are after. Min-Max Live Luminosity lets you blend between minimum and maximum pixel calculations to alter the luminosity of your image. When the macro has been run, you can double-click the Min-Max Luminosity layer to access the controls. Min-Max Blend changes the balance between minimum and maximum pixel ranges. Then you can alter max and min strength separately. There is also an optional nonlinear boost, which adds a gamma power curve to brighten the image up if required. So here is the before and the after, where we have managed to dampen much of the star detail and also intensify the colours. Deepen Color Detail uses an interesting layer structure and blend mode setup to darken tones whilst saturating them simultaneously. You can expand the group and change the opacity of color structure to experiment with this effect further. And you can, of course, change the opacity of the top level group as well to alter the overall strength of the effect. Enhanced DSO Luminosity can be used generally across most imagery to brighten and enhance deep sky objects. It's especially useful for bringing out nebula detail when you also have bright stars to contend with, where doing a more traditional tone stretch with curves, for example, would tend to brighten that star detail as well. Golden Boost is an interesting macro because it temporarily composites in the lab color space, and it uses the A and B opponent color channels to lend images a powerful golden hue. You can also change the opacity of the created layer to control the strength of the effect. These two macros that enhance emission regions are an interesting experiment. They enhance tonal regions by colorizing them using the typical colors you would associate with false color compositions. For example, the sulfur and hydrogen alpha tone enhancement will tint everything more towards red and green, where sulfur is mapped to red and hydrogen alpha to green, whereas the oxygen and hydrogen alpha tone enhancement will tint everything more towards green and blue, where oxygen is mapped to blue and hydrogen alpha is mapped to green. Now we have all the signal enhancements. These are great fun and very useful for a wide range of imagery. Here, for example, I can use Enhance Blue Signal, and this selectively brings out all of this background detail, as well as colorizing these stars. These macros are all stackable, so feel free to apply more than one. For example, I'll enhance Red Signal, Blue, Cyan, and Yellow. And once I apply the Red Signal enhancement a second time, the effect might be too strong. Not a problem. I can simply lower the opacity of the group here. I can do this for the other groups as well if I feel that the blue and cyan enhancements are slightly too strong. These two reduce harsh noise macros are very much for edge case scenarios where you have this harsh, pixelated noise, typically introduced once you have performed some retouching work. Regular denoising doesn't really reduce this, so instead I have created these quick macros that you can run to tackle it. The Plus version is simply more aggressive, but you do risk blurring the image detail slightly, so be careful when using this. That said, we are talking about a significant zoom level when we are inspecting this detail. When viewing at 100%, the result is perfectly acceptable. Even when you stack plenty of quality data, you will inevitably run into both luminance and chrominance noise issues, especially if you need to tone stretch your data significantly. You can use one of the denoise macros to help reduce noise, but you will see both unstretched and stretched data variants. Basically, you want to apply the unstretched data variant just above your data layers before any tone stretching adjustments, like so. The stretched data variants should be applied above your various adjustment layers that are performing tone stretching. Generally, denoising unstretched data is more effective, but I have provided both options for you to experiment with. Chroma denoise will just remove the color noise, leaving all of the luminance structure intact. This is useful if the Luma and Chroma denoise macro is reducing textural detail too much for your liking. Structure denoise will reduce both luminance and chrominance noise, but will apply some structural enhancement to compensate for the reduction in textural detail. The stretched data version also has an optional second pass layer, and you can enable this for further noise reduction. As always, experiment to see which options work best for your own imagery. We are now back at the composition setup macros, which I covered at the beginning of this video, but I will just briefly cover the monochrome mapping option we have here. This is for when you just have singular grayscale data. For example, I've captured some narrowband hydrogen alpha data of the Heart Nebula. Once you have done your tone stretching, you can run this monochrome color mapping macro above the tone stretching layers to map the grayscale data to a color range. Within the group here, you will find the color mapping layer. Double-click this to access the gradient map dialog. Then you can change the balance of the gradient stops to suit your imagery. You can, of course, change the main object color if you want to as well. The result can be modified further with the rest of the adjustments here, such as brightness and contrast, saturation, luminosity, and so on. You may have noticed two additional options at the bottom here: merge to 16-bit sRGB and merge to 16-bit wide gamut. In more recent releases of these macros, I have started providing a 16-bit macro category in addition to the main 32-bit category. It contains most of the macros apart from the tone stretching macros and the composition setup macros. This is because compositing in 32-bit is computationally very taxing, especially for computers that may not be able to use hardware acceleration with a compatible graphics card. Therefore, what you can do is set up your initial data layers and tone stretching, like I have done here, then use either of these merge macros. They will automatically merge and create a new layer for you and convert the document to 16-bit precision. You can then use the same macros, but enjoy a noticeable boost in performance when editing. This is a great approach if you are struggling with slowdown and you still want to take advantage of Affinity Photo's non-destructive editing capabilities. Finally, I will just explain the difference between sRGB and wide gamut. sRGB is very much the safe color profile, as you can ensure that people will see reasonably accurate colors even if their imaging software or web browser does not support color management. Now instead, if I just roll the history back to before I ran that merge macro, and instead merge to 16-bit wide gamut, this will convert to the ROM RGB profile instead, which is essentially Pro Photo. This allows you to potentially retain more intense color values in your imagery if they fall outside the range of sRGB, and it will also allow you to saturate color detail and create more intense colors artificially if you wish to. However, you do need to be mindful when it comes to exporting. If your goal is to export a JPEG or a TIFF that you can share with others, I would recommend clicking More and setting the ICC profile option to sRGB, which will ensure your final exported image is converted to the sRGB color profile. Otherwise, you may notice significant color shifts when viewing your image in other software that is not color managed. That concludes my tutorial video on how to use my astrophotography macros for Affinity Photo. I hope you have found it useful and that it gives you some good ideas for using the macros with your own imagery. Thank you very much for watching.